Hello, everyone. I'm going to wait a couple more minutes to see if Board Member Grable jumps on. So we will get ready shortly. I believe Board Member Grable is trying to sign on now, so we will wait another minute to see if he gets on. Okay, it looks like we have all of the board members on. Director Burke, do we have everyone from staff?
Yes, I believe we are ready to go from the staff side.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I'd like to call the meeting to order at 2:03. Secretary Atha, if we could have a roll call.
Yes, Chair Watts.
Here.
Board Member Grable.
Here.
Board Member Wright.
Here.
Thank you. And just as a reminder for everyone to please mute their phones and microphones when you're not speaking, that would be great. All right. Now I'd like to open it up for public comments. If anyone wishes to make a comment via Zoom, please raise your hand. If you are dialing in via telephone, please dial *9 to raise your hand. Secretary Atha, are there any live public comments or voicemails from public comments?
No, we have no public comments.
Great, thank you. So we will move to item 3.1. Director Burke, if you could introduce this item.
Thank you, Chair Watts and members of the subcommittee. Our first item is our fiscal year 21-22 through fiscal year 24-25 proposed water and wastewater rate recommendation. Before I introduce staff, I'd just like to very much thank the subcommittee for all the work that you have done. This has been a really long process, at least for us on the staff side. Been about 2 years that we've been working on this, so a lot of big effort on from staff, and just really want to thank the subcommittee because I think we've been working with you for probably about 6 months now. Really appreciate your time and effort and work on this. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to our Deputy Director of Administration, Kimberly Zanino. She's going to lead it off for staff, and also Mark Hildebrand with Hildebrand Consulting will be presenting on this item.
Good afternoon. As Director Burke said, Mark Hildebrand will be doing the presentation for this portion of the items that are on your agenda today. I have to echo that this has been a lot of work over a very long period of time, and it's very much appreciated, all of the staff who has participated in this and developing the recommendation for you. I'm hoping that you all received your copy of the rate study update report that we sent out. It was quite long, so I wanted to make sure that you got that in enough time so that you could review it at your convenience. And that's the basis for the rate recommendation that we're bringing forward to you today. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Mark to do the presentation. I will be sharing my screen, Mark, so that you can just tell me when to change for your slides.
Okay, thank you. There we go. Well, thank you for having me. I've met several of you in the past, but I think there's a few new faces out there. So as way of introduction, my name is Mark Hildebrand. I'm with Hildebrand Consulting. I'm working closely with Bob Reed of the Reed Group, who's also on the call today. Bob has done quite a bit of work with the city of Santa Rosa over the past couple decades, and he was the author of the last water and wastewater rate study. We did this study together, and he'll be giving some of the presentations following this one today. So next slide. So what we'd like to cover today, I'll be covering the first bullet here of the agenda, speaking directly about the water and wastewater rates. And then following that, Bob will give a presentation on the water shortage contingency plan and your demand fees for developers. Next slide. Okay, next slide. So as a way of sort of introducing rate studies, I know that some of you may not have been through an entire water or wastewater rate study in the past. So just by way of introduction, there's three main steps that are followed when doing a rate study. The first we call revenue requirements. You could also call this a financial plan. And this is where we simply look at all the revenues coming into a utility and all the expenses going out. And so the majority of the revenue is going to be in the form of rate revenue, which is paid by your ratepayers on a monthly basis. But there's also some other miscellaneous revenues that we look at. And then your expenses will be in the form of operating expenses and capital spending and debt. And so in the revenue requirements, we're really looking at financial strategies, whether you need to issue debt, how to manage your reserves, and ultimately how much you need to adjust your rate revenue in order to make the utility whole. Once we understand how much total revenue is required into the utility over the planning period, we look to cost of service. And cost of service is really identifying how your different customers drive your costs. So looking, for example, on the water side, you have your single family homes and your irrigation accounts and your commercial, and they all use your water system differently. And so we look at their behaviors, the size of their accounts, the way they use the water, how much water they use, and we allocate costs to them. And this is really the cornerstone of what's called Proposition 218, which is the law in California that governs how you can charge rates. And that law requires that your rates be proportionate to the cost of providing service. And this is really where we really make sure that that's being done properly. And then the last step, rate design, is once we know how much revenue we're going to collect from a certain customer class, then we decide how we're going to recover it. So that's really in the form of fixed revenue versus variable revenue, so the fixed meter charge or the usage charge, and then whether we're going to charge tiered rates or uniform rates and those types of decisions. Next slide. So some highlights from this study. We're going to go through and give you the final recommendations that we're making, but we wanted to cover some of these major details, I guess I'll call them, within the analysis. The first piece of news, which is really good news for the city, is that you just completed the issuance of your 2020 Series A, which is new money to pay for a UV project at the wastewater treatment plant, and the 2020 Series B, which is a refunding of an earlier 2012 bonds. And the 2020A series provided you with $70 million for that project. So, and you got a really good rate for that. It's a really good time to go out for debt at this time. Interest rates are really low. And then the refunding of the 2012 bond is actually going to save your ratepayers over $16 million over the next 14 years. So that was a big success. The other piece that was looked at very carefully over the last year has been reassessing the reserves, the catastrophic reserves within each of the enterprises to make sure that the city is prepared for different natural disasters that may occur. And this is a analysis that's been done by GHD Engineering, and you'll see that the reserves that they're the cash reserves that they're recommending are significantly higher than what has historically been held by the city. So we'll go over those in detail. We did update what we call the cost of service analysis. We're following the same methodology that was followed during the last study, but by its nature, cost of service analyses take in specific data from your system, financial data, as well as user data. And so we've updated all those numbers within that analysis. We did keep the same general rate structures that you've had, so it should be familiar to you for those of you who are already familiar with those rate structures. And then the one probably other piece of big news is that we are recommending that you eliminate the automatic pass-through of the Sonoma Water rate changes. So what you've done in the past is that you waited for Sonoma Water to announce what its rate increases were going to be for the next year, and you built those percent increases into your rates and passed those costs on to your customer. And the reason that was done in the past, the reason that you adopted the pass-through mechanism, in other words, waiting to hear what Sonoma Water announced before actually adopting the rates, was because Sonoma Water wasn't as good as communicating what it was planning to do with its rates. It wasn't providing forecasts, and the increases were a bit more volatile. They've improved quite a bit in that regard, and they're providing a lot more forecast information. And at this point, there's a pretty good understanding of what those rate increases will look like over the next 5 years. So what we are recommending is that we simply forecast those costs just like we do with all other costs, with a certain amount of understanding of what they'll be, and going ahead and adopting the rates now, with the risk that they might not be exactly what we forecast, but we have a pretty high degree of certainty of what they will be, and we don't expect it to be very different from that. So that what the benefit of that is that you'll be able to adopt a rate schedule that's not going to change, and so it provides a lot more transparency to your customers. They know exactly what they're going to be paying for the next 5 years. Next slide. So here's some details on the catastrophic reserves, and within the water utility, that particular catastrophic reserve level GHD is recommending that you increase it from almost $6 million to $17.5 million. And the good news is that within the water utility currently, you have enough undesignated reserves that you're able to meet that target almost immediately. So you already have cash reserves to position you to be able to meet that increased target. And we'll show you the details of that cash flow analysis in a couple more slides. On the wastewater side, they're recommending to increase it from 6.8 to 21.5. And again, you're able to meet those reserves through your cash balance. And in this particular case, one of the major reasons that you're able to do that is because of that favorable bond issue that we just described earlier. So that really positioned you to be able to meet these new reserve recommendations. On the regional wastewater utility, so again, the regional wastewater utility refers to the treatment plants that's shared with other regional member agencies. We're assuming that it's $10 million. It's going from 1.7 to 10 million. GHD has not completed the analysis yet, and so we have a placeholder for $10 million. They have recommended that your geysers reserve increase from 1.25 to 3.3. Some other policy updates within those reserves is that we are recommending that you change the language to be a bit broader. It used to refer specifically to earthquakes, and now we're suggesting that it include events such as fires, floods, pandemics, droughts, etc. That gives you a lot more flexibility to be able to react to those types of events. We are recommending that you modify the policy level over time. So in other words, as appropriate, maybe increase the levels with inflation in order to keep up with cost inflation. And right, so that's the final bullet. That particular slide was quite a bit. Should I pause here, Jennifer, Kimberly, and take questions, or do you want me to keep going?
Chair Watts, it's up to you, but I would suggest we could probably keep going. And if the board members have any questions throughout, feel free to stop us at any time.
Yeah, that's fine with me.
Yeah, I should have mentioned in the beginning. Anytime you want to jump in, I am happy to take a pause. Okay, next slide. So here's a graph with quite a bit of information. So I'll walk through it slowly, but this is a cash flow analysis of your water utility over the next 10 years. And what you see here at the top in the foreground are some blue columns, and that represents your expenses. And so the light blue would be your operating expenses, operating and maintenance. The hashed in the center here is your debt expense. And the dark blue at the top would be your capital spending, cash financed capital spending. In the background, you see the green, which represents your revenue. So the dark green at the bottom is your miscellaneous revenue. The darker green in the middle is your existing rate revenue from your existing rates. And then the light green at the top would be the additional rate revenue that you would be collecting if you were to adopt the rate increases, which are shown down here at the bottom. So in this particular scenario, we're recommending that a 4-year schedule of rate increases of 2%, 3%, 3%, 4%. The years beyond that show slightly higher rate increases. This is a bit atypical for us to show lower rate increases followed by higher rate increases. The reason that we're making this recommendation is, one, to recognize the economic situation that we're currently in with COVID. And Bob and I have seen quite a bit of engagement by ratepayers, and we have a pretty strong understanding of the amount of difficulty that they're going through. And by staff's direction and in our agreement, we think that we should try to keep rates as low as possible over the next coming years. The other reason is that you are meeting your reserve targets. So there's really no big drive to increase rates over the next 4 years. You can see this jump here. So this next graph in the middle describes your reserve levels, and you can see your existing targets are down near $10 million here, and they jump up to over $20 million with that increase in the catastrophic reserve target that I mentioned. And the blue line represents your actual reserve. So you can see that you're already positioned to nearly meet those increased reserve targets almost immediately. And so you really don't need larger rates than this in order to be able to meet your reserve targets. But out here in the future, the reason that your rates will jump a bit is you can see your debt service increases in 2026. This is as a result of some debt that you've issued in the past that doesn't start to be charged until 2026. So you have a jump in your reserve schedule that occurs out here, and that's the main driver for why rates need to increase a bit after 2026. The last piece of information on here is at the bottom, your debt coverage ratio. These numbers are extremely healthy. The minimum level that we recommend is 1.5, and you're well in excess of that. So your debt coverage ratio, which is a measure of how easily you can afford your debt, is not driving the rates at all. This is here as a point of interest, but it's really not affecting our recommendations at all. Okay, next slide. So this next slide is the same general picture, but for the wastewater side. And you can see the same general schematic at the top with the revenues and the expenses really balancing each other out here, where the expense, whenever the expenses and the revenues are at the same level, you're essentially in a balanced budget for that year. And you can see that your reserve levels aren't changing much. The reserve targets are increasing slightly over time with inflation, and your reserve levels are staying pretty flat. And so eventually, by about 2028, you'll be right at your reserve targets. You can see the rate increases over the next 4 years are very modest. As a general rule of thumb, we recommend whenever possible to always adjust your rates by some amount. It's considered a best practice within the industry to always make some sort of adjustment to your rates in order to recognize that cost inflation is occurring. What you want to avoid is situations where you don't have rate increases for a few years and then all of a sudden you have to spike the rates by 10% and then go back to zero and go up and down like that. It's much more sustainable and much easier to manage the utility when you implement modest rate increases that keep up with inflation, which is what you're seeing here. So kudos to your staff for positioning the utility to be able to absorb these increases to the reserves without a big shock to your ratepayers. And we do list the capital spending here. The CIP is the capital improvement plan. This is the capital spending that will occur for the local wastewater system, which is your collection system, essentially. Next slide. So here's just a summary slide with the rate increases that we just mentioned, just as a easy point of reference. Again, these are quite modest and hopefully will, especially for the first year, will be recognized as not too much of a burden on your ratepayers. Next slide. So let's switch gears here. That was the financial plan, talking about the general adjustment to your overall revenue. Now we're going to switch gears into cost of service and rate design. And so when we look at rate design in particular, these are the objectives that we follow. First, we want to make sure that they're financially sufficient and sustainable. And so that's what we just covered with the financial plan. And then as we look to design your rates and to levy those rates on your customers, we first and foremost want to make sure that they're legally compliant. And by that, I mean that we comply with Proposition 218, which I mentioned earlier, which simply says that you can't charge any customer more than the cost of providing the service to them. And so the analysis that you'll see coming up follows those principles and ensures that we're complying with those requirements. We're also looking to promote water conservation, have a stable source of revenue that's predictable and easy to manage for staff and easy financially to manage your utility. We look to minimize your rate increases. Whenever possible, we try to structure rates to maximize affordability. And we also try to avoid complexity that makes it hard for the public to understand. Next slide. So as we allocate costs to your different customers, here are some of the principles that we followed. So there's some costs that we call customer costs that we assign to each account regardless of the size. So that would be costs associated with sending bills out or customer service or that type of thing, which is really a cost that is incurred regardless of the size or the amount of water that's used by a customer. Next, we look at capacity costs, which is the size of your system. So irrespective of how much water or wastewater is actually traveling through it, we look at the size of your pipes and your pump stations, and we allocate those costs to your customers based on the size of their meter, because your meter is an indication of how much capacity is required to serve you. Regardless of whether you're using that meter or not, the system needs to be behind it in order to be able to service that meter, because the next person might need to use the entire meter. So we assign those capacity costs to customers on that basis. Commodity costs are assigned to each customer based on how much they use. So in other words, how much water they use or how much wastewater they produce. And these are costs that are really variable that that follow the trends of usage. We look at the cost of water supply and the cost of your water conservation in order to justify your tiered rates, and we'll show that in more detail in another slide. And then on the wastewater side, the usage rates are also tiered in the sense that we charge more for low strength versus high strength, and that again is tied to the cost of treatment and chemicals and the like to treat different strength sewage. Next slide. So here's a graphic that explains how your tiered rates are justified. And what you can see is that all customers pay the same amount within their tiered rates for general costs. The water supply is incrementally higher for tier 2. And the reason is because you have two sources of supply. One is your groundwater, which is a very limited amount of water, but it's also significantly cheaper than your other source of water, which is water that's purchased from Sonoma Water. So we're giving the benefit of that cheap groundwater to tier 1 users. So you can see that the unit cost of tier 1 water is a little bit less than tier 2, and that's simply because the benefit of that cheaper water is built into tier 1 and not into tier 2. Tier 2 is purely Sonoma Water, purchased water from Sonoma Water. And then the last piece that adds additional cost to tier 2 is the cost of your water conservation program, which we're going to collect that revenue from your tier 2 customers, because if you didn't have higher water users, you wouldn't need that program. So that's the justification. Next slide. So here's a table with quite a few numbers, but your tier schedule, or your water rate schedule has got a lot of components to it. So I'm not going to go through every single number, obviously, but it's here for your reference. This shows all the usage rates at the top for single family, multifamily, irrigation, potable irrigation, recycled water, tier 1 and 2. Your multifamily, commercial, industrial, and institutional, they all pay a uniform rate. So in other words, they pay a single rate, and that's because it's hard to come up with a break point for how much tier 1 water to give to those types of customers versus tier 2. So we keep it simple by charging them a uniform rate, which is really a weighted average. It's the product. If you took the weighted average of the tier 1 versus tier 2 water sold to the other customers, you'd come up with this number. So it's quite equitable in that regard. You can see the change in dollars and percent over in the right column. And you can see that those percentages are all quite small. There's a little bit of a difference in how much is being allocated to your usage rates compared to your monthly service charges. Down at the bottom, there's a little bit more being charged to your monthly service charges. And that's simply, it's not a change in policy. That's simply a product of a change in the costs that your utility is incurring. Largely, it's because of an increase in capital spending that is recovered from your monthly service charges. And so that part of your charge is going up incrementally a bit more than your usage rates. Okay, next slide. This one's for your wastewater. And same idea here, where we have the usage rates at the top, monthly service charges down below, which are charged by meter size. As I mentioned earlier, the usage rates for commercial are charged low, standard, medium, and high strength. And again, these are justified based on assumptions about the strength of the sewage in terms of what we call BOD, which is biochemical oxygen demand, which is really a measure of how much oxygen or which translates into energy or electricity that's needed to pump oxygen into the water to treat it. And then there's also a TSS, which is your suspended solids, basically the solids in there, and that takes a certain amount of energy and chemicals to extract that's the solids. And so we charge more to your high strength customers. Next slide. So this next slide helps put things into perspective. What this is, there's a lot of numbers, and I won't go through all of them, but you do have this in your packet for a more careful review at your leisure. But this is showing what we call a bill impact analysis, which is how different types of customers are going to be affected by these changes. So what we try to do is identify a representative cross section of your different types of customers. For example, for single family residential, we looked at low, medium, high, and very high water users, all with the same meter size. You can see we made some assumptions about the amount of water that they use in thousands of gallons per month, and wastewater produced. And it shows what their bill would be with their current rates in the first group of numbers there, and then what their bill would be with the proposed rates, and the change to the total bill, both in dollars and percent in the last columns. So again, you can see that the impact to the different types of customers is pretty even all the way across. The total impact hovers between 1% and 2% for most of your customers. And that's a indication that we didn't make any big changes to the cost of service analysis. As I mentioned, sometimes when we come in and make big changes to cost of service, you'll see, one group have a drop in their bill and others see a 10% increase. But in this case, it's quite even across all your customers. So there's no big losers, so to speak. Next slide. This is another view of the same idea, giving a bit more of a breakdown for your average residential bill. You have these different components for the total bill between the sewer bill and the water bill, and provides it in a bit more detail. And it also shows how much that bill will increase over the next 4 years with the increases that are being proposed. And this next slide, Kimberly, did you want to speak to this one?
I wasn't really going to say a lot, but we wanted to make sure that this stayed in the slide deck so that you were continued to be reminded that we are working on this Value of Water campaign. We should be seeing a second video fairly soon, and that will be shared with the full board also. But just that we are making all efforts in this very different time to try to reach out to our customers to let them know that we are working on this, and that we are and will be coming forward with a rate increase schedule, and that these are the reasons for that. So we're just really trying to make sure that everybody continues to be aware of the communication piece and the communication tools that are going on even during this very different kind of a time for outreach.
Thank you. And then next slide is my last slide. It's just a summary slide. Talks about our overall recommendation here is to adopt the proposed water and wastewater rate increases and the schedules as will be described in detail in our report, which will be submitted in the next coming month or so. We don't have a final timeline on that report, but it is largely completed. Jennifer or Kimberly, did you have anything to add at the conclusion of that before we, I guess, take questions or move on to the water contingency plan presentation?
Thank you, Mark, and Chair Watson, members of the subcommittee. I just want to, again, thank you for the work and the work of staff. I think we took to heart really the feedback and input that we received from the board and council members, really trying to find a rate recommendation that was reasonable and took into account everything that we are facing as well as our customers are facing related to COVID. And so what you have here before you, we are recommending that the subcommittee consider this 4-year rate recommendation, and if you support it, we'd like you to recommend this to the Board of Public Utilities. So we're actually looking for a formal recommendation from the committee. And with that, we have a lot of staff that's available, including myself and the rate consultants that can answer any questions that hopefully can answer any questions that the committee may have.
Great. Thank you. Board members, do you have any questions about the presentation so far? Seeing none, I do want to acknowledge that I know how hard this has been, especially with the changing numbers and trying to predict how COVID and the recession is going to be impacting our ratepayers. So thank you so much for working to keep our rate increases as low as they are. That is really something that you guys should be proud of, and something that we should be proud of as a board, to be able to present this to council as recommendation for moving forward for our ratepayers. I just had one kind of comment that I know the staff does such a wide job of educating our ratepayers and the city as a whole, just around every type of program that we have, including when we are, the Prop 218 requirements for the rate structure. And I was just hoping that we can also bring in somehow in the education around water conservation also saves dollars for households. So I know you guys do that in a lot of your programming. I just want to make sure I remind us of that, because I think that that's also important to recognize, especially with the tier 2, having the water conservation programs being part of that tier 2, and that fits perfectly where it should be. But just reminding our ratepayers that if we save water, we save money too. So not just good for our environment, but for the pockets as well. So I guess we'll open this up for public comment then. So for item 3.1, if you wish to make a comment via Zoom, please raise your hand. If you're dialing in via telephone, please dial *9 to raise your hand. Secretary Atha, do we have any live or pre-recorded public comments at this time?
There are no public comments.
Okay, great. Thank you. So with that, I'll entertain a motion to recommend, and I don't want to read the whole thing, so.
I recommend, I move that we recommend the rate increase in the whole program. I don't have it in front of me either to do that.
I will second that.
Great. So we will waive the further reading. So can we please get a roll call vote on that?
Chair Watts?
Yes.
Board Member Grable?
Aye.
Board Member Wright?
Yes.
Great, thank you. So we will move that recommendation to the full board, and we'll move on to item 3.2. Director Burke, if you want to reintroduce for this item.
Thank you, Chair Watts and members of the subcommittee. So item 3.2 is going to be information on our urban water shortage contingency plan and our proposed water shortage charges recommendation. And we have a number of staff who are available to answer questions, but I am actually going to turn this directly over to our rate consultant, and Bob Reed with the Reed Group will be making this presentation.
Good afternoon, Chair Watts and other members of the subcommittee. Pleasure to be with you this afternoon. We're going to talk about the water shortage contingency plan here and the water shortage rates that are associated with that. The general rate recommendations that Mark talked about are for normal periods where we have normal water supplies and normal water usage, and the plan there is to cover the next 4 years with general rate adjustments. The water shortage contingency plan, the water shortage rates deal with situations where if we get into an extended drought or other water shortage situation, that we have a way to make sure the utilities stay financially whole. So Kimberly, if you could move ahead a slide. This is a separate component of the rates. Now, the water shortage contingency plan is a component of your urban water management plan. And that is a document that's prepared every 5 years in accordance with state statutes. Water shortage contingency plan is a part of that document. It's one of the appendices. The state has recently prescribed different water shortage stages, and your update of the water shortage contingency plan is consistent with that. It's actually a little bit more detailed in that regard, with having different stages of shortage with water use reduction goals each step along the way. And within that different stages, we have both water shortage charges and excess use penalties that come into play depending on the severity and the specific conditions during shortage conditions that I'll describe. Next slide. This slide summarizes the 8 stages that are being defined and incorporated in the water shortage contingency plan beyond normal water supply and demand conditions. Stage 1 is a voluntary condition where up to 10% reduction in water use is being encouraged by customers. And then beyond that, we move into mandatory water shortage stages. And at each stage, there are different restrictions on water use and so on, depending on the severity and conditions at that time. The water shortage surcharges are really focused on what happens during the more severe stages where we have mandatory conditions. So we don't do anything in stage 1, which is purely voluntary, but we do look at imposing a water shortage charge at stage 2 and going all the way through stage 8, and they change with each stage. And then also in the more severe stages, starting in stage 5, we have an excess use penalty, which is something that all customers could avoid if they meet water use restrictions, but is there to provide a greater incentive to meet those use reduction goals in the more severe stages. So if we move to the next slide. We take an approach that considers a 3-prong approach to a financial strategy to bridge a financial gap that is created when we are in selling less water due to a water shortage. First of all, we look at using a portion of our available financial reserves. These might be some of your undesignated reserves and or your catastrophic reserves, depending on what's available to you at the time of a shortage. We look at implementing that water shortage charge that I mentioned, and we'll talk more about in a moment. And then also in the more severe stages, we can look at deferring a portion of the capital improvement program and your capital spending as a way of preserving cash. So our 3-prong approach is to use available cash, reach into our pockets, to generate additional cash through the shortage surcharge, or to preserve cash by deferring some of the capital program. And we look at all 3 of these things to help manage the financial deficit and to limit the strain that's put on the utility from a financial perspective. Moving to the next slide. This graph shows the financial deficit that is created as we reduce water use at the various stages of water shortage. This is without any actions being taken. What would happen is, as we sell less water, we generate less revenue because we're selling less water. Some of our costs decline because we're not buying as much water when we're not selling that water. And so some of the costs decline, but expenses generally continue on. And so what happens is our revenues fall more than our expenses do. And so it creates a gap between revenue and expenses. And that's what we're looking at bridging through this financial strategy. If we move to the next slide. Looking at that financial gap, we use that 3-prong approach to bridge that gap. So the bars in this graph are basically that gap between revenues and expenses. And at all stages, we look at using our available reserves, and that's kind of the brownish bottom part of the stack bars here. At stage 1, since it's entirely a voluntary program, we're going to rely on financial reserves, either undesignated or catastrophic reserves, to bridge that financial gap over a year-long period that could be, approaching $2 million. And then as we move into the mandatory stages, we can implement that water shortage charge and generate some additional revenue. And then beyond that, we can even start deferring a part of our capital program and preserve some of the cash. So you can see, particularly in the later stages, we're using all three of those approaches to bridge that financial gap and limit the financial risk placed on the utility. So with the next slide here, this shows, and again, a lot of numbers here, but it shows the water shortage surcharges as well as the excess use penalties and how they would be applied. These would generally come into play during the mandatory stages of water shortage. They apply to the water usage rates of your normal rate structure, not to the service charges. So the service charges would remain in place and would not change, would not increase during the shortage. But instead, we would initially impose a water shortage charge. And this is basically an increase in the water usage rates. In stage 2, as you can see at the top of this table, stage 2, that would be 5% increase to those water usage rates. Stage 3, 7.5%, and so on as you go across the top there, all the way to a 45% rate increase if we got to a stage 8 situation, which is more than a 50% reduction in water usage being required. And you can see in the middle part of this slide the way the rates would change. So for example, the single family tier structure, what's being proposed for the upcoming year is $597 for tier 1 and $676 for tier 2. If we were in a stage 2 condition, those would increase to $627 and $710 with that 5% water shortage charge, and the other rates are calculated similarly. Things change when we get to stage 5, and this is where we start to get into more stringent use reductions as well as allocations to customers as to how much water they can use. And with that, we institute a different rate structure that includes the excess use penalty. This becomes a 3-tier structure for all customers, where the water use up to your water allocation for each customer is at tier 1. And then if we go above that, customers would then experience first that tier 2 excess use penalty. And then if they go over 150% of their water allocation, would get into a 3rd tier, which is an even greater penalty. The water shortage charges would still apply in these rates, but the excess use penalty would also kick in for tier 2 and tier 3. And those rates are shown on this table for stages 5, 6, 7, and 8. So you can see they become fairly significant. I would like to say that while the water shortage charges are intended to generate some additional revenue and will, and they apply to all water use during from stage 2 on up, and would generate additional revenue. The excess use penalties are something that all customers will be able to avoid entirely simply by staying within the water allocation that's been assigned to them. For that reason, we're not expecting or anticipating revenue to be generated from those penalties. But to the extent that any revenue does come in from those penalties, those would be applied to cover the costs associated with the shortage conditions or to replenish reserves that are being depleted to help meet the needs of the utility during the shortage conditions. But they're not planned to occur because they are completely avoidable by customers. If we go to the next slide, one of the aspects of taking this 3-tier approach is that customers that meet the water use reduction goals during any of these shortage conditions will have lower water bills than they would have with the normal water rates under standard normal water usage conditions. But customers that don't meet those reduction goals or ignore them completely will have higher water bills as a result. And the top half of this table shows what happens for a typical single family customer that is meeting those use reduction goals. You can see here on this that even though that water shortage charge starts to occur and be part of the water bill in stage 2 and on up, so even though they're paying a little bit that way because they're using less water, their total bill goes down somewhat. And so they can see smaller water bills as a result of meeting the water use reduction goals. The bottom half of this table shows that those customers that do not meet the water use reduction goals will not only pay that water shortage charge, but could also pay that excess use penalty and could see some significant increases in their bill. Of course, what actually happens with any individual customer will depend on their situation and how much water they're using and how much water they're not using. But this illustrates that general concept that if you meet the use reduction goal, you will save a little bit of money, and if you don't, that there will be higher costs associated with continuing to get that higher level of water service. So if we move on to the next slide, this is our recommendation, or staff's recommendation related to the water shortage rates, and that is that the budget subcommittee recommend to the Board of Public Utilities that the proposed water shortage rates and structure be included in the water shortage contingency plan. This set of rates is being developed in conjunction with that water shortage contingency plan rather than the separate rate study report. However, both of these, both the general water rates, water and wastewater rates that Mark talked about, as well as these water shortage rates, will need to be adapted through the Prop 218 process. And so both of the elements will be included in the notice that goes out to customers. And in fact, I think on our next slide here, those rate setting steps is we would finalize the recommendations, present that information to the BPU next month, and then a presentation to the City Council in March. At that point, we would be looking for direction to send notices out to all customers under the requirements of Prop 218, which requires a 45-day notice period before the hearing, and then the public hearing to adopt both the water and wastewater rates as well as the water shortage charges would be considered for adoption at a public hearing in May of 2021. And I think at this point I will pause for questions and comments related to this segment of our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any committee member questions or comments? All right, seeing or hearing none, I will entertain a motion for this recommendation.
I'll move that we adopt
Wait, sorry, I forgot
sorry to
public
interrupt.
comment.
Oh, shame on you.
No, this is probably my fault. I'm sorry. I think we had a little. Are you going to do the motion then open up for public comment?
That's what I forgot to do. So let's go back.
Yeah, sorry about that. So yes,
No,
you need to do public comment first.
Well, now we will take public comment for item 3.2. If you wish to make a comment via Zoom, please raise your hand. If you are dialing in via telephone, please dial *9 to raise your hand. Secretary Ava, do we have any live or pre-recorded public comments on item 3.2?
There are no public comments.
Great, thank you. Now I will entertain a motion for this recommendation.
Okay, I move that we adopt the urban water shortage contingency plan as presented today.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Great, thank you.
Apologies. Sorry. I think for clarification, we're only asking for the water shortage charges, not the entire plan. You will see.
Oh, I'm
that in the
sorry.
future. So
Right,
just the water shortage charges, please.
So corrected.
Great, thank you. Board Member Grable, do you second that amended motion?
Yes.
Great, thank you. Secretary Ava, if we can get a vote on that, that would be great.
Chair Watts,
Aye.
Board Member Grable,
Aye.
Board Member Wright,
Aye.
Thank you, and thank you for your patience of my misstep. We will now move to item 3.3. Director Burke, if you could introduce this item.
Thank you, Chair Watson, members of the committee. And this item is just presented for your review and direction. So item 3.3 will be an update on the water and wastewater demand fees study. And again, we have staff available to answer questions, but I'm going to turn this directly over to Bob Reed to present this item.
Great, thank you. And Kimberly, there you go. So, and you can go to the next slide. The third major task of the work that we've been doing for the city is related to demand fees for the water and wastewater utilities. And these are the fees paid by new development for new connections to the water system, or in some cases, if somebody is upsizing the size of their water meter or making other change in use to the utility services, sometimes an additional fee is applied. But these are generally, one-time fees associated with establishing that service. The legal standard here is something spelled out in the government code, which requires that these fees not exceed the estimated reasonable costs of providing the service. And so it's a pretty broad and general requirement for this type of fee. And if we go to the next slide, the way that we approach the fee calculation for the city's water and wastewater utilities is with what's commonly referred to as a system buy-in methodology. And here we're looking at the present value of water and wastewater system assets and facilities. We consider the age and useful life of the assets, what their historical cost has been, including costs associated with financing of those facilities, if there's debt financing. And we come up with a current dollar value, current point in time dollar value of those facilities, and we divide that by units of development or units of demand to come up with a unit fee. So this is a fairly common methodology. It's really best applied in areas that are largely built out, where infrastructure is in place and capacity is available for new development, or sometimes where if expansion is needed, that the cost to expand is consistent or similar to what the historical costs have been. We are looking at the cost of existing facilities and the historical cost information and fixed asset records. So we're not relying on plans or studies or future estimates of what might be in the future, but we're looking at actual cost history and expenditure and financing history. And because of this approach, we don't need to rely on capacity analyses or assessment of future needs. That each new connection is buying into the system on par with existing customers that have made investment in the system. So this is a pretty standard methodology. There are other methodologies out in the industry, but your current fees are based on this approach, and it is appropriate for the city in its sort of broad life cycle of development within the city and its infrastructure. So moving on to the next slide. This very briefly summarizes the water and wastewater demand fee calculation. At the top of this, we've got a summary of the fixed asset valuation of all the facilities. This is information coming from your fixed asset records, part of the financial accounting system. We take the historical original cost to acquire facilities, and on an asset by asset basis, we escalate those to current dollar value, and then we also reflect the depreciation that is occurring based on the accounting service life of the asset. So there's an escalation that brings the value up, and then a depreciation that brings the value down somewhat to reflect the fact that the assets in the ground are no longer brand new. So you can see pretty significant investment in the utilities that you have here. The wastewater system, we are breaking separately the local wastewater, basically the collection system component, separate from the sub-regional or the regional water reuse facilities that are used more broadly than just the city by some of your neighboring communities. Beyond that valuation of the assets themselves, we make some adjustments to this valuation. We add in the present value of past debt issuance costs, as well as past interest costs, the cost to finance the facilities are part of the acquisition cost. So we add those in there. To the extent that there is outstanding principal on your long-term debt, we subtract that out. That reflects the fact that you haven't yet acquired all of those facilities, that you're still paying for them through the financing mechanism. The water system and the wastewater collection system have very limited amount of debt, but you can see there's a pretty significant debt associated with the sub-regional system. I would add that we looked at the fixed asset valuation and this analysis at the end of last fiscal year, or June of 2019, which is when we had the fixed asset records and the valuation. So this does not yet include the new debt issue associated with the 2020 financing, because we're looking at fixed asset records that existed prior to that point in time. Once we come up with the full value, we also add in any capital reserves. These are monies that are set aside and designated for capital spending. So not your operating reserve or your undesignated reserves, but to the extent you've got demand fee revenues that have already been collected or money that have been budgeted and set aside or appropriated for capital projects, we add that in there. That dollar in the bank is going to be a piece of pipe in the ground. And so we add that to the value. We then take the total system valuation, we divide by the current system demands to come up with unit demand fees. And these are expressed on $1 per 1,000 gallon per month basis. So that's an increment of either water use or wastewater flow generation, 1,000 TGM, 1,000 gallons per month to come up with our demand fees. And at that point, we also combine the local wastewater and the regional reuse system together into a single fee. These basic unit fee amounts are increasing, fairly significant increase on the water side, and an increase on the wastewater side as well, although more moderate. But these increases are being offset, and really more than offset, by changes in the water use or sewer flow generation characteristics. If we move to the next slide. One of the things that we did with this update was to look at recent water use and sewer flow data. And this slide shows the water use factors used for the demand fee study for different types of residential water use. Single family, we have broken down between large, medium, and small lot sizes. This is consistent with your current fee approach. We are making a change here with some of your other residential categories. We're breaking duplexes, we're breaking out duplexes and triplexes from other multifamily units. They show somewhat different use characteristics, and generally duplexes and triplexes aren't required to have separate irrigation meters for water service, whereas when we get into fourplexes or larger apartment complexes, condominiums, mobile homes, in most cases, they're required to have a separate irrigation meter, and they exhibit different water use characteristics for that reason. We also have a separate category for some of the smaller residential units. These include the large accessory dwelling units, single resident occupancy units, senior housing. And the city is starting to see some high density, small apartment units that are limited in size. And so we're creating a new category for those sort of special situations. So all of these water use factors were generated by looking at water use data from the last 4 calendar years, so 2016 through 2019. Did a pretty detailed analysis of water use records for these different types of residential development. And those are depicted here. For your non-residential development, commercial, industrial, irrigation usage, The demand fees are based on an actual estimate of what their water use will be on a case-by-case basis. So rather than a standard factor per dwelling unit that applies to residential, for the non-residential, it's based on a calculation that's made for each proposed development project. If you go to the next slide, this summarizes the current and proposed water demand fees for different types of residential development, and then that base fee for the non-residential development. You can see here fairly, well, at the largest lot size, the fee goes up slightly, not quite by $200, and the smaller lots goes up slightly, but the medium-sized residential lot goes down somewhat. And so a variety of changes here. And we've got another slide that kind of summarizes on a dollar and percentage basis of the total fee amount. But this is the result of applying those water use factors to the higher fee amount. We go through the same process on the wastewater charges. So if we look at wastewater use factors, again, we were looking at winter water use and the sewer cap that from 2016 through 2019 to go through a similar analysis to come up with the wastewater flow factors for different types of residential development. And those are summarized here. We don't have the irrigation connections, but we do have that same breakout of duplexes and triplexes separate from other multifamily housing here, even though they're from the wastewater perspective, the use factors are the same, but we, being consistent with the water side, have that shown as a separate category here. And then the fee amounts for the wastewater demand fees with the next slide. You can see here that applying these new use factors, that in all cases, the residential wastewater demand fees are going down, even though the fee amount, the base unit fee amount, is going up somewhat. The smaller demand factors are resulting in lower demand fees across all residential development. And again, for your non-residential development, it'll be a function of the actual use characteristics associated with each proposed development project. We can summarize all of this for both water and wastewater on the next slide. This shows combined water and wastewater demand fees under the current fee structure versus the proposed fee structure. You can see across the spectrum of residential development types, it's a reduction. There is a reduction in the amount of combined water and wastewater demand fees. And then for the non-residential, again, it'll depend on the specific usage characteristics associated with each planned development project. This was a pretty comprehensive update of your water and wastewater demand fees using current financial information and then updating with these new usage factors that are reflecting kind of shifts in demand patterns that have resulted in the last number of years due to the recent recession and then drought conditions that have resulted in lower demands that seem to have created a new normal. And so those are being reflected here. I will add that consistent with past practice, we're also recommending that the demand fees be adjusted each year on an annual basis to reflect changes in the construction cost index as published by the Engineering News Record, and that will make sure that your fee amounts keep pace with inflation and that you update the fee calculation every 3 to 5 years or so. So if we move to the next slide here, the next step with respect to the demand fees is staff is currently reviewing our draft fee report. And then we would finalize those recommendations and then come back for final review with the subcommittee and then go on to the BPU and City Council for adoption. These fees do not need to go through a Prop 218 process, but there is still an adoption approval process that needs to be followed. So with that, I'll turn things back over to you, Chair Watts. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Do we have any board member questions regarding this presentation? Board member Wright?
Yeah, I just have a sort of related question. So when we charge the developer or owner of the property these demand fees, do we charge them at the permit time or at the final map time, or when do they get charged? When is the basis of the charge? In other words, I can see that if we're adjusting it every year, there's going to be a big rush to get your demand fees in that particular year. So how do we handle that?
There are, I'll take that one. There are some different ways now because there have been some new opportunities opened up for developers. There are times when people can defer fees. There are payment plans available for some developments in the downtown area. But typically they need to pay those fees prior to having a meter set. They almost always do, unless obviously there's a deferral. In the payment plans, they have to make their first payment first, but they're set at the time that payment plan goes into effect. So they wouldn't get increased based on the yearly increases. If they go into a payment plan with us, they make payments based on what it was when they had those meters set. So there are varying times when people pay them. They can pay them though ahead of time as well. So if they are ready to pull a permit and their permit is at a place where they're allowed to pay fees, they could pay those fees prior to actually asking for their meters to be set. So there are various times, and we do see when there are significant changes that people can kind of rush to come and make payments on properties that they have, but they do have to be somewhere in the process. They couldn't just come into the office and say, 3 years down the road, I'm going to build this. I want to pay demand fees based on that. They have to have at least an application submitted and be in the process of deciding what they're going to be developing and have that actually be moving forward.
And if I could add on, we do send a letter every year to sort of developers, development community, to let them know that the increase the annual increase is going into effect. This year, we added language letting them know that we are up in the process of updating our demand fee study. So we want to make sure that they're aware. And then Kimberly is working on putting together a plan for how we're going to outreach to the various associations as well, so that we can make sure that they're informed of the fee study and what we're doing, and get any feedback or input from those groups before we bring this forward to the BPU and the council.
Thank you. I would think that developers would want to delay their demand fees based on this information now. Good presentation. Thank you.
Board member Grable?
Yeah, I just have a couple questions on the demand fees. One is, are we still doing the deferrals? We passed a policy, gosh, it was probably 2018, based on incentivizing, higher density and more affordable housing. And I think it was just the downtown area or the downtown station area. And I don't know if that was part of that plan update. I want to say it was sort of independent, but we did pass something regarding at least fee deferrals on those units. And then I know we did another similar policy on ADUs, and I can't remember the exact specifics of it. But I guess I was wondering if and how we're determining when we're to grant fee deferrals in the future as part of this. And then also, what's the nexus like in terms of where our demand fees are compared to other jurisdictions, especially on the smaller and denser units like ADUs and affordable housing, the dense apartment complexes, those kinds of things that obviously we're trying to incentivize as well as a city.
So I can answer questions on deferrals. Yes, there are still deferrals allowed in the downtown area. I think they may have even expanded that in planning and economic development a little bit, but I'm not sure about that because it's a combination of many fees that they are allowed to defer. But it is for the higher density units, the higher density buildings. As far as ADUs go, we still, based on the intent of state law, are not charging fees for units up to 750 square feet that are ADUs. Over that, which is why we call out the large ADU in the fee schedule, those will be charged at that rate that you see listed there. I think Bob may have more information about neighboring communities, but for us, this is really based on the valuation of our system and also our characteristics of our actual users as well. Because many, as we started to do a little bit of research around the very high density type developments, found that in many places, they are still charging by meter size or footage of a property. So methodologies aren't all necessarily the same. And I don't know, I'll ask Bob if he has any additional information about other communities or neighboring communities.
Yeah, we as part of this work, we did not do a survey of what other communities are charging in terms of demand fees. In the past, when we've done that, I mean, it's fairly easy to look at a typical residential type development and do a comparison that way. But as soon as you start looking into situations of either, how do you handle the ADU or, particular type of development or particularly non-residential development, then it's all over the map, and it's really hard to do an apples comparison without really getting into the weeds. I would say that I am not familiar with communities really looking at, although it may be going on, with really incentivizing, the smaller type development and encouraging, trying to encourage particular types of development. The whole ADU issue is one that's been evolving over the last 5 years or so, and will probably continue to evolve. But how individual communities respond and react to those changing statutory requirements and guidelines is something that's fairly fluid. So that's probably not a very satisfactory answer. I'm sorry to say, but that's sort of what our experience has been lately.
Okay. And I appreciate that. We definitely have some specific, we both for our Prop 218 and sort of fiscal responsible and our fiduciary duty to our citizens. I know that we have to do a specific rate study that is specific to our users. In cases of overall impact fee studies and nexus studies, at a certain point, you got to compare something, and it's helpful at least to see where we lie in those nexus studies, even if it's just a snapshot and isn't meant to say, well, all things being equal, because we know they're not, right? But it would definitely be helpful for me, and I don't know if that's something that could be done for the full board or the council at some point, whenever this goes to a final approval. But I know that there are others that feel the same way, just because on one hand, right, we have to do what's right for our system so that we're capturing our costs adequately. On the other hand, are we too low in some cases for certain types of development? Are we too high for other types? Considering that we also want to make sure that we are compared to other jurisdictions that we're not an outlier, right? And also I would say that we the same reason in other departments, and this is coming from kind of my policy world of overall development policy and looking at these similar to any other fee structure that is levied, like inclusionary housing fees, capital fees, parks fees, school fees, all of these things. You take into account at some point what types of development you're incentivizing, right? And what are your gradated sort of fee schedules. What are they trying to accomplish? What's the reason for, because otherwise it would just be the same fee for everybody, right? There's obviously something there that is partly the nature of the users, but it's also partly, you know, the type of development it is, or the type of property it is. So for me, it'd definitely be helpful just to see where we lie there, because we also want, in the long run, in the long term, we want to not, we don't want to take incentives away where we could be giving them it, where we have the ability and the legal authority to do it, incentives for more, you know, healthy development, walkable cities, these kinds of things that also create more users. And the more users we have, also the more, I think, resilient our overall system is, at a time when California is, you know, is losing people. So just in that long-term realm of not having population attrition and or not building the types of housing that that might retain and keep our overall holistic system of city government solvent, and our water system too. It's just one of those things that I think about in that real long term, from that long term perspective. Which, again, the overall sort of housing policy wonk in me looks at all of these different fees and wonders what the, you know, just where we're at compared to other jurisdictions, and why would someone choose to build an apartment complex in downtown Santa Rosa when they can do it for half as much in impact fees in Rohnert Park. I'm not saying that's true, but you know, that's where I'm going. Is where are we at in regard to that, so that we're not either creating too much incentive for one type of development or not enough for another, without knowing where we're at compared to those other areas, if that makes sense.
So thank you, Board Member Grable. You know, as this is the kind of information that we're looking for from the subcommittee, what additional information you'd like to see. We're not asking for a decision at this point in time. This is the initial share of the information. So we can definitely take this back and look at sort of neighboring communities and see if we can get a comparison for our recommendation on the demand fees. From a whole fee impact perspective, I'll see what we can do there. That's really, we may need to work with PED and see if we can bring them in, because we're really only looking at the water and wastewater demand fees. But we'll check in with the Planning and Economic Development Department and see if there's additional information they have and could potentially provide from that perspective. And then we'll definitely get the specific updates and information on the deferrals. As Kimberly mentioned, none of those policy deferral have changed from the council, so they're still in place, and they may have actually increased. And to your point about kind of where the council's housing policy is and what they're looking for, you know, part of the reason why we're doing this demand fee update was really to ensure that we have the correct information about ADUs, as well as looking at that sort of new high-rise development that we haven't seen previously. We wanted to make sure that we had data and information and have a fee that's specific for that, because we haven't seen that in the past. So really taking into account where the council is going and what they're prioritizing, that's part of the reason why this demand fee update is coming forward.
Thank you. And yeah, I was, just so I'm not, thank you, Director Burke. Yeah, that definitely clarifies it for me. And also, yeah, I definitely wasn't asking staff to do a larger impact fee nexus. I know that's daunting, and I know that Clara Hartman and others are working on those things constantly. But yeah, just in terms of our wheelhouse, the water and sewer, and where we fit in the overall impact fee structure, and then the nexus more broadly between jurisdictions, just on those water and sewer fees for different types of development, be it large single family homes, smaller homes, large ADUs, high density apartments, and even deed restricted affordable housing and low income housing. Are other jurisdictions doing something different? Is there another tool that we might look at because we have this, kind of opportunity to look at some things before we're bringing an official recommendation. I know you have a lot on your plate, so I hesitate to ask these things, but if not now, then when we have a little bit of an opportunity to just look at what those possibilities are.
Yes, thank you. We'll definitely take that back, and we'll bring that to a future subcommittee meeting.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I think that would be interesting to just kind of see where we fit into the larger picture of some of the council's goals and so forth as well. I think that's important when we're making decisions like this and recommendations. And I appreciate all the work going into this portion, and I think we will look forward to more information coming back to the subcommittee before we make a formal recommendation. So at this time, I'd like to take any public comments on item 3.3. So if you wish to make a comment via Zoom, please raise your hand. If you are dialing in via telephone, please dial *9 to raise your hand. Secretary Etha, do we have any live or pre-recorded public comments at this time?
There are no public comments.
Great. With that, I believe that concludes our meeting for today. So we will look forward to our next subcommittee meeting. See you all on Thursday, and we will adjourn. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.